Most TV dramas are just clever writing and good actors. But what if I told you that some of the most popular shows on Netflix and HBO are based on real cases so disturbing that the truth is much darker than the fiction? What if I told you that one of these shows led to a $170 million lawsuit, and another is about a real killer who is still walking free in Paris today? Right now, we are diving into the first level of the disturbing TV show's iceberg. We are talking about cult symbols burned into skin, fake doctors who left patients paralyzed, and stalkers who were never caught. If you think you know these shows, wait until you hear the truth behind them. Let's start. Level 1. Baby Reindeer. When this show dropped on Netflix in 2024, it became a global obsession overnight. The series was created by a Scottish comedian named Richard Gadd, and the very first thing you see on the screen is a bold statement. This is a true story. That single sentence would later cost Netflix a $170 million lawsuit. Richard Gadd plays a fictional version of himself. He claims that, years ago, a woman walked into the bar where he worked, and his small act of kindness, just giving her a free cup of tea, started a years-long stalking nightmare. According to Gadd, the real woman sent him over 41,000 emails, hundreds of hours of voicemails, and showed up at his home, his work, and even attacked his girlfriend in the street. Within days of the show being released, online sleuths on TikTok and Reddit found the real Martha. A Scottish woman named Fiona Harvey was identified, and her social media accounts were public, with posts that looked exactly like the messages from the show. The internet had basically doxed a real person based on a Netflix drama. Fiona Harvey then did something nobody expected. She sat down for a public interview with Piers Morgan and denied almost everything. And then she filed a $170 million lawsuit against Netflix for defamation. She said the true story was full of lies and that her life was destroyed by online hate. The truth nobody can answer is who is actually telling the truth, the alleged stalker or the alleged victim. The lawsuit is still going on today, and the legal outcome could change the way streaming platforms label true story content forever. If you've ever wondered how someone could walk into the most expensive hotels in New York with no money and live like a princess for years, this is your answer. Inventing Anna is the Shonda Rhimes Netflix series based on the real life of a woman named Anna Sorokin, who called herself Anna Dalvey and pretended to be a German heiress with a €60 million trust fund. The real story is almost more unbelievable than the show. From around 2013 to 2017, Anna lived in 5-star hotels, flew on private jets, and was friends with celebrities, models, and Wall Street bankers. The truth was that she had no money at all, and that her father was a former trucker back in Germany. Anna was running a giant fraud, using fake bank statements, forged wire transfer documents, and pure confidence to trick banks, hotels, and rich people into giving her money and free services. She was eventually arrested and convicted of multiple counts of grand larceny and theft of services, and was sentenced up to 12 years in prison. But here's where the story gets even crazier. Netflix paid the real Anna Sorokin around $320,000 for the rights to her life story, which means she literally got paid for the crimes she committed. But the most unbelievable part is what is happening right now. After her release, she was supposed to be deported back to Germany, but she fought it. Today, she lives in New York with an ankle monitor, hosts art shows, has a podcast, and was even on Dancing with the Stars. The woman who scammed New York is now a celebrity who's being paid for being famous for scamming New York, and she has openly admitted in interviews that she has no real regret for what she did to her victims. The Act. The story behind The Act is the kind of case that makes true crime fans question what a victim actually looks like. The Hulu series, starring Joey King and Patricia Arquette, tells the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her mother Dee Dee Blanchard, and the truth behind it is one of the most twisted family cases in modern history. For most of her life, Gypsy was told she was extremely sick. Her mother said she had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, asthma, seizures, and the mind of a 7-year-old. Gypsy used a wheelchair, had a feeding tube, and her head was shaved to make her look like a cancer patient. Charities donated trips to Disney World. Doctors performed surgeries on her teeth and eyes. The community in Springfield, Missouri thought Dee Dee was a saint. Almost none of it was real. Dee Dee Blanchard had a condition called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where a caregiver makes a child appear sick for attention and sympathy. Gypsy could walk just fine, she didn't have leukemia, and she didn't need a single one of those medications her mother was forcing her to take. The fraud went on for years. The way it all ended is something nobody saw coming. In June 2015, Gypsy met a man named Nicholas Godejohn online, and together they made a plan. Nicholas drove to Missouri, snuck into the house, and stabbed Dee Dee Blanchard 17 times in her own bed while Gypsy hid in the bathroom with her hands over her ears. Gypsy was sentenced to 10 years. She was released in December 2023 and immediately became a viral influencer with millions of followers. Now you see her doing makeup videos and pregnancy posts on Instagram, while the question of whether she was a victim, a killer, or both at the same time is something even psychologists still can't agree on. The Watcher. This Netflix series, created by Ryan Murphy, looks like a regular haunted house story, but the address at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey is 100% real, and so are the letters. In 2014, a family named the Broaduses bought their dream home for around $1.3 million. 3 days after they got the keys, they checked their mailbox and found the first letter. The letter was signed by someone calling themselves The Watcher. The author claimed that 657 Boulevard had been the subject of my family for decades, and that they had been put in charge of watching the house. The letter asked detailed questions like, have they found out what's in the walls yet? And asked about the Broaduses' 3 young children, by mentioning the changes they made to the windows. The family had only been there for 72 hours. The Broaduses called the police and never even moved in. More letters arrived over the next months. The Watcher knew their daily routines, their car colors, the names they were thinking of for the kids' bedrooms. The letters mentioned young blood and asked which of the children was going to be on the 3rd floor. The handwriting was on a real envelope with a real stamp, mailed from a local post office. The most chilling part is that the case is still unsolved today. The police investigated dozens of suspects, including neighbors and previous owners. DNA was found on the envelopes, but never matched anyone in any database. The Broaduses were forced to sell the house at a major financial loss because nobody else wanted to buy it. New owners moved in years later, and reports say even they have received letters. Whoever is writing those letters is still out there in that quiet New Jersey street. And the truth might be that this is not one person at all, but a tradition that has been passed down on Boulevard for generations. This was only level 1 of our iceberg. We are barely scratching the surface of what really happened behind your favorite shows. As we go deeper, the cases become more disturbing. The criminals become more dangerous, and the line between television and the real world starts to disappear. Stay with us until the final level, because what we found at the very bottom involves CIA experiments, contested Nazi war criminals, and a serial killer who is still suspected of murdering girls that nobody ever found. Level 2. Dr. Death. We're now entering level 2, and the cases here are no longer just about lies and scams. They're about real people losing their lives. Dr. Death is the Peacock series based on the true story of a man named Christopher Dunch, a neurosurgeon in Texas who was supposed to fix people's spines but ended up doing the exact opposite. Between 2011 and 2013, Christopher Dunch performed surgeries on 38 patients in the Dallas area, and out of those 38 people, 33 were left seriously injured, paralyzed, or dead. He cut nerves that should have never been cut, left surgical sponges inside people's bodies, and drilled into the wrong parts of the spine over and over again. One patient woke up paralyzed. Another patient, his own childhood friend Jerry Summers, woke up unable to move from the neck down. A woman named Kelly Martin bled to death on the operating table. But here is what makes this case so much worse. The medical system protected him for years. When hospitals fired Dunch, they didn't report him to the medical board. They just let him quietly move to the next hospital because nobody wanted a lawsuit. He kept getting hired, kept operating, and kept hurting people. According to court records, his colleagues described him as showing up to surgeries impaired, possibly using cocaine and LSD before going into the operating room. He was finally stopped by two surgeons, Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby, who refused to let it continue. They went to the press and the police. In 2017, Christopher Dunch became one of the only doctors in American history to be sent to prison for what he did inside an operating room. He received a life sentence for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and that weapon was his own scalpel. The hospitals that kept hiring him after they knew what he was doing were never charged with anything, and most of them are still operating today as if nothing ever happened. The Girl from Plainville. This Hulu series is based on a court case that completely changed how people think about words and death. The Girl from Plainville tells the real story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy III, two teenagers from Massachusetts who fell in love mostly through text messages. Conrad Roy was 18 years old, suffered from severe depression, and had attempted to take his own life before. Michelle Carter was 17 and also had her own mental health struggles. In the beginning, the texts between them looked like the messages of a girlfriend trying to help her boyfriend get better. She told him to take his medications and to talk to a therapist. But something changed in the summer of 2014. The texts shifted from "please get help" to something much darker, with Michelle now telling Conrad that he should actually do it. She gave him advice on the methods and told him to stop being scared. On July 12, 2014, Conrad drove his truck to a Kmart parking lot and started a generator inside the cab to fill it with carbon monoxide. The most chilling part of this case is what happened next. According to her own later testimony, when Conrad got scared and stepped out of the truck, Michelle was on the phone with him. She told him to get back in. Those three words became the center of the trial. Conrad got back in the truck and he died. Michelle Carter was charged with involuntary manslaughter, even though she was not physically there. The judge ruled that her words alone were enough to make her legally responsible. She was sentenced to 15 months in prison. The case raised a question that the law had never really answered before. Can a text message kill someone? In Massachusetts, the answer is now legally yes, and that single ruling has changed how prosecutors look at digital evidence forever. The Serpent. The BBC and Netflix series The Serpent looks like a stylish 1970s thriller, but every single victim in it was a real person, and the killer at the center of the show was alive and free until very recently. Charles Sobraj, also known as the Bikini Killer and the Serpent, is one of the most disturbing serial killers of the 20th century, and his story is even worse than what was put on screen. In the 1970s, thousands of young Western backpackers traveled through the so-called hippie trail through Thailand, Nepal, and India looking for cheap drugs and spiritual meaning. Charles Sobraj saw them as easy targets. He would befriend them, often inviting them to dinner at his apartment. Once they trusted him, he would slowly poison them with drugs to make them sick. While they were too weak to escape, he would steal their passports, their money, and their identities. The murders that followed were brutal. Authorities believed he killed at least 12 backpackers, although the real number could be much higher. Some victims were drowned in the ocean while wearing bikinis, which is where his nickname came from. Others were strangled or burned. He used the stolen passports to travel from country to country, always one step ahead of the police. But here's the part that makes this case sit on level 2. Charles Sobraj was a master of escape. He was caught in India, but in 1986, he organized one of the most famous prison breaks in history by drugging the guards with sweets at his own birthday party. He was finally captured for good in Nepal in 2003. The most disturbing twist: in December 2022, Nepal released him from prison because he was 78 years old and considered too old to be a threat. Charles Sobraj is alive today, living in France, giving interviews, and never expressed real remorse. Do you think a man who killed at least 12 people deserves to die a free man at home? Level 3. Mindhunter. We're now entering level 3, and this is where the killers stop being the side characters and start becoming the subject. The Netflix series Mindhunter, produced by David Fincher, is based on the real book written by FBI agent John E. Douglas, who basically invented the field of criminal profiling in the 1970s. In the show, 2 agents traveled to maximum security prisons across America to interview the worst killers in the country. The real-life behavioral science unit at the FBI did exactly that. They sat down with men like Edmund Kemper, Charles Manson, David Berkowitz, Richard Speck, and dozens of others. They wanted to understand how a serial killer thinks, how they choose their victims, and how to catch the next one before it was too late. What makes Mindhunter so unsettling is how accurate it really is. The interview scenes with Edmund Kemper, the giant 6'9" man who killed his own mother, and 6 female college students in California, are based on real, recorded conversations. Kemper would calmly describe to the FBI agents how he murdered his victims, what he did with the bodies, and even how he played with his mother's vocal cords after she was already dead. Agent Douglas later admitted in interviews that some of these conversations gave him nightmares for years and contributed to his nervous breakdown. But here is something that didn't make it fully into the show. The real John Douglas did not just analyze old cases. He was used by police departments around the country during active investigations. His profiles helped catch the BTK killer, the Atlanta child murderer, and many others. He spent so much time inside the minds of these men that he himself almost became one of their victims. In 1983, Douglas collapsed during a case in Seattle and was put in a coma. The doctors said the stress of profiling killers had nearly killed him. Do you think you could sit in a small room with Edmund Kemper and ask him how he killed his own mother? Most people couldn't. 5 Days at Memorial. This Apple TV series is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by journalist Sherry Fink, and it tells one of the darkest stories in modern American medicine. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in August 2005, a hospital named Memorial Medical Center was cut off from the world for 5 days. The conditions inside that hospital were a real-life nightmare. The power went out, which meant no air conditioning, no working ventilators, and no functioning elevators. The temperature inside the rooms reached over 100 degrees. The toilets stopped working, and the water came up to the 2nd floor. Sick patients on life support were stuck on the upper floors with no way to be moved, while the doctors and nurses hadn't slept in days, and rescue boats and helicopters were not coming. What happened next is the part that is still being argued about today. According to Sherry Fink's investigation, the staff began making categories of patients. The healthiest were evacuated first. The sickest, especially those with do not resuscitate orders or those considered too heavy to carry down the stairs, were placed in the last category. Witnesses later told investigators that some of those patients were given injections of morphine and a sedative called Versed in the final hours before evacuation. By the time the hospital was finally evacuated, 45 patients were found dead inside Memorial Medical Center. The Louisiana Attorney General arrested Dr. Anna Powell and 2 nurses on charges of second-degree murder, but a grand jury later refused to bring the case to trial. To this day, nobody has ever been convicted, and Dr. Powell still works as a doctor in Louisiana. The question this case forces us to ask is one that has no good answer. When there is no rescue and no hope, is mercy a crime? Candy. The Hulu series Candy and the Max series Love and Death are both based on the same incredibly disturbing real case from 1980. The story takes place in a small religious town called Wiley, Texas, where 2 church-going housewives, Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore, were close friends. On the surface, both women were perfect 1980s housewives. They went to the same Methodist church, their kids played together, and their husbands were friends. Behind that perfect picture, Candy Montgomery was having a long affair with Betty's husband, Alan Gore. The affair ended months before the murder, and the 2 families went back to being normal friends. On Friday the 13th, June 1980, Candy went over to Betty's house to pick up a swimsuit for one of the kids. What happened inside that small laundry room turned this case into one of the most violent crimes in Texas history. Candy struck Betty Gore with a 3-foot-long axe a total of 41 times. The injuries were so massive that the sheriff's deputies who arrived at the scene reportedly threw up. Betty's baby was found alone in the crib, having cried for hours. The most disturbing part of this case is not the murder itself, it's the verdict. Candy Montgomery hired a famous defense lawyer who used a then new psychological theory called dissociative reaction. She claimed Betty attacked her first with the axe, that Candy fought back in self-defense, and that during the fight she snapped because of repressed childhood trauma. The all-male jury believed her. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. She moved to a different state, changed her name, and is still alive today, living a quiet life as a counselor. Do you believe that a woman can hit another woman 41 times with an axe in pure self-defense? Level 4. The Dropout. We've now reached Level 4, and this case shows that not every monster carries a knife. Some of them wear black turtlenecks. The Hulu series The Dropout tells the real story of Elizabeth Holmes, the Stanford dropout who built a $9 billion company on a complete lie. In 2003, when she was only 19 years old, Elizabeth Holmes founded a company called Theranos. She claimed she had invented a device that could run hundreds of medical tests on a single drop of blood. No more big needles, no more giant labs, just a small machine called the Edison that would change healthcare forever. She raised hundreds of millions of dollars from people like Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, and former US Secretary of Defense James Mattis. There was just one problem. The machine didn't work. Internal tests inside Theranos showed the Edison gave wildly wrong results, sometimes telling healthy patients they had HIV or cancer, and telling sick patients they were healthy. Despite knowing this, Theranos partnered with Walgreens and started running real blood tests on real patients across the country. The real horror was happening inside those Walgreens. Real patients, including pregnant women, were getting results that could change their lives, and many of those results were completely wrong. People were told they were having miscarriages when they weren't. Others were told their cancer markers were rising when they were healthy. Behind it all, Elizabeth Holmes had also lowered her natural voice to a deeper tone to sound more authoritative in business meetings. Almost everything about her was performance. The truth came out thanks to a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou and former Theranos employees who became whistleblowers. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud. She's currently serving an 11-year prison sentence and gave birth to 2 children right before reporting to prison. Do you think she actually believed her own lie, or was she just a very good actress from the very beginning? We Own This City. The HBO series We Own This City was created by David Simon, the same man behind The Wire, but this one is not a fictional drama. It's a dramatization of one of the worst police corruption scandals in modern American history. Every officer named in the show is real. Every robbery happened. Every drug deal between cops and criminals is in the federal court records. The story follows the Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force, an elite unit that was supposed to take guns off the street. In reality, this group of officers had turned themselves into a criminal gang with badges. They were robbing drug dealers, stealing money from suspects' homes during raids, planting drugs and weapons on innocent people, and selling stolen narcotics back onto the street. The leader was a sergeant named Wayne Jenkins. According to FBI documents, Jenkins and his team would identify drug dealers, follow them, and then rob them at gunpoint while wearing their police uniforms. They knew their victims would never report it because the victims were criminals themselves. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. They stole watches. They even stole prescription drugs to resell. What makes this case truly dark is how long the city of Baltimore let this go on. Multiple complaints and red flags about Jenkins were ignored or quietly buried for years. When the FBI finally arrested the unit in 2017 and started flipping officers, the entire scope of the corruption shocked the nation. One officer who was supposed to testify against the unit, Detective Sean Suter, was found shot in the head 1 day before he was supposed to talk. His death was officially ruled as a suicide, but to this day, many people in Baltimore are convinced he was killed to keep him quiet. Do you believe Detective Suter took his own life, or is there still something darker hidden in this case? The Assassination of Gianni Versace. This is level 4, but the story behind this Ryan Murphy series is a slow-motion disaster that the FBI saw coming weeks before it ended in a pool of blood on the steps of a Miami Beach mansion. The show focuses on the murder of fashion designer Gianni Versace, but the real horror is the 4 other victims that nobody talks about. The killer was a 27-year-old man named Andrew Cunanan, who on the surface was charming, intelligent, and well-dressed. He came from California and lived a fake life of luxury, telling people he came from rich families and had Hollywood connections, when almost none of it was actually true. In the spring of 1997, something snapped inside him, and Cunanan went on a killing spree that crossed 5 states. What makes this case so painful is how preventable it all was. His first 2 victims, Jeffrey Trail and David Madsen, were former friends he killed in Minnesota in late April 1997. His third victim was a 72-year-old real estate developer named Lee Miglin, who was killed in his own garage in Chicago. Police found the murder weapons, identified Cunanan, and put him on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Wanted posters were printed. His face was on national news. Despite all of this, Andrew Cunanan was able to drive a stolen truck across the country, live openly in a cheap motel in Miami Beach for 2 months, and even pawn one of his victims' coins under his real name. The pawn shop reported it to the FBI, but the warning was lost in the system. On the morning of July 15, 1997, Cunanan walked up to Gianni Versace as he came home from buying coffee and shot him twice in the head on the front steps of his Miami mansion. 8 days later, Cunanan killed himself in a houseboat just 3 blocks from where Versace lived. To this day, no one knows the real motive. Do you think the FBI failed Versace? Or did the system simply move too slowly to catch a man who wanted to disappear? Level 5. The Staircase. We've reached Level 5, and this is where the cases stop having clear villains. The HBO series The Staircase, starring Colin Firth and Toni Collette, is based on a real death in Durham, North Carolina that has divided investigators, journalists, and juries for over 20 years. On the night of December 9, 2001, the 911 dispatcher in Durham received a frantic call from a famous novelist named Michael Peterson. He said his wife, Kathleen, had fallen down the stairs in their luxury home. When the paramedics arrived, what they found didn't look like a fall. Kathleen Peterson was lying at the bottom of a narrow staircase in a massive amount of blood, with 7 deep lacerations on the back of her head. The prosecution said this was a brutal murder. They argued that the amount of blood was impossible for a simple fall, that Michael had beaten his wife to death with some kind of weapon, and they pointed to a possible motive. Investigators discovered that Michael Peterson had been hiding a secret life. He had been emailing male escorts and exchanging explicit messages, while his wife thought their marriage was perfect. But here is the part that turned this case into a national obsession. Investigators found that years earlier, in Germany, Michael Peterson had been close friends with a woman named Elizabeth Ratliff. One night, Elizabeth was found dead at the bottom of her own staircase. Michael Peterson was the last person to see her alive. Both women, decades apart, both close to the same man, both found at the bottom of stairs, covered in blood. After 2 trials, a guilty verdict, an overturned verdict, and a new investigation, Michael Peterson eventually entered something called an Alford plea. This is a strange legal move where the person does not admit guilt, but accepts that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. He served a few more years and walked free. Some people still believe in the famous owl theory, that an owl attacked Kathleen at the top of the stairs and caused her to fall. After hearing all of this, what do you really think happened in that house? Manhunt, Unabomber. The Discovery series Manhunt Unabomber tells the story of one of the longest and most disturbing manhunts in FBI history. For 17 years, between 1978 and 1995, a man known only as the Unabomber sent homemade bombs through the mail to scientists, professors, and businessmen across the United States. He killed 3 people and injured 23, and the FBI had absolutely no idea who he was. The bomber's targets seemed completely random, ranging from a computer science professor at Yale to the president of the United Airlines and a timber industry executive in California. The bombs themselves were almost untraceable because every single part was handmade from wood, scrap metal, and basic chemicals. There were no fingerprints, no serial numbers, and nothing the FBI could follow. The case became the most expensive investigation in FBI history at that point. In 1995, the bomber sent a 35,000-word manifesto to the New York Times and the Washington Post and demanded they publish it, or he would keep killing. The manifesto was a long, angry essay against modern technology and industrial society. The Attorney General made the controversial decision to print it, hoping someone in the public might recognize the writing. The truth about who he really was is the part that still feels surreal today. A man named David Kaczynski read the manifesto and began to recognize the strange phrases and ideas. They sounded exactly like the letters his older brother Ted had been writing for years. Ted Kaczynski was a former mathematics genius who graduated from Harvard at 16 and became a professor at UC Berkeley before quitting and disappearing into a tiny cabin in the Montana wilderness. David made the impossible decision to turn his own brother into the FBI. When the FBI raided Ted Kaczynski's cabin in 1996, they found bomb-making materials, hand-typed manifesto drafts, and a finished bomb ready to be mailed. Ted Kaczynski was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died by suicide in his prison cell in June 2023. After living in a small wooden box with no electricity for over 20 years, the question that still divides historians is whether he was a genius driven mad by the modern world, or whether he was always going to become this monster. The Vow and Seduced. These two HBO documentaries cover one of the most disturbing modern American cults, and unlike many cult stories, this one happened in our lifetime. NXIVM, pronounced Nexium, looked from the outside like a high-end self-help company, with personal development courses that cost thousands of dollars per session. Famous actors, billionaires, and the daughter of the Mexican president were all members. The leader was a man named Keith Raniere, who his followers called Vanguard. He told his members that he was the smartest man in the world, and that he could help them reach their full potential. The classes used strange language and color-coded sashes, like a martial arts ranking system. Members swore lifetime loyalty, but underneath the self-help language was something much darker. In 2017, a former member named Sarah Edmondson revealed the existence of a secret inner group called DOS. The women in DOS were told they were joining a women's empowerment program. In reality, they were giving up collateral, which were photos, bank account information, and even sex tapes that would be released if they ever spoke about the group. But what was really happening inside DOS was much darker. The women in DOS were branded with a cauterizing pen by a real doctor, who burned a symbol into the skin near their hip, and the symbol was actually Keith Raniere's initials. The women had to thank him for the brand afterwards. They were also actually given to him as part of the program, kept on extreme low-calorie diets, and made to do tasks at all hours of the night. In 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico, brought back to the United States, and convicted on charges including racketeering, and forced labor. He was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. The actress Allison Mack also went to prison for her role in recruiting women. Today, Keith Raniere is locked up but still has loyal followers on the outside who do choreographed dances in front of his prison. After hearing how this group operated, do you think you would have seen the warning signs? Or are these cults much harder to spot than people think? Level 6. Making a murderer. We've now entered level 6, and we're no longer talking about cases with clear answers. The Netflix series Making a Murderer became a global phenomenon in 2015 and forced millions of people to ask one terrifying question. What if your government decided you were guilty and there was nothing you could do to stop it? The story begins with a man named Stephen Avery from Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. In 1985, he was wrongfully convicted of a brutal sexual assault. He spent 18 years of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. In 2003, DNA evidence finally proved his innocence, and the real attacker was identified. Stephen Avery was released and immediately filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County for stealing 2 decades of his life. Then, something unbelievable happened. In November 2005, just as the lawsuit was about to settle, a young photographer named Teresa Halbach disappeared. The last place she was seen was the Avery family's auto salvage yard, where she had gone to photograph a vehicle. Her car was found on the property, pieces of bone were found in a burn pit, and the keys to her car were found in Stephen Avery's bedroom, sitting in plain sight in a place that had supposedly been searched by police multiple times. But everything that came next is what made this case a global phenomenon. Stephen Avery's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was interrogated by police for hours without a parent or a real lawyer present. Brendan, who has a low IQ and learning difficulties, eventually confessed to helping his uncle. His confession is on tape, and watching it is one of the most painful pieces of footage in the entire documentary, because it looks like the officers are feeding him the answers and he's just nodding along. Both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The documentary suggests heavy police corruption, planted evidence, and a county that wanted revenge for the original wrongful conviction. To this day, Stephen Avery still maintains he's innocent, and millions of viewers around the world believe him. After watching the case yourself, do you think Stephen Avery murdered Teresa Halbach? Or did the same county that destroyed his life once destroy it twice? Say Nothing. The FX series Say Nothing, based on the book by Patrick Radden Keefe, is one of the most disturbing dramas ever made, because it's built on real graves that took decades to find. The story takes place during the Troubles, the violent conflict in Northern Ireland that lasted from the late 1960s to 1998. At the center of the show is the disappearance of a woman named Jean McConville. She was a 38-year-old widow living in West Belfast with 10 children. In December 1972, a group of masked men and women came to her door and dragged her away in front of her own kids. They told the family she would be back soon. She never came home. For over 30 years, the children of Jean McConville did not know if their mother was dead or alive. The real horror of this case is who took her and why. According to the book and the show, Jean McConville was kidnapped by members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, also known as the IRA, who accused her of being a British informer. Many historians and former IRA members say this accusation was probably untrue. She was driven across the border, shot once in the back of the head, and buried in a secret grave on a beach in Ireland, where her body wasn't found until 2003. But here is why the case sits at level 6. A project at Boston College recorded private interviews with former IRA members on the condition that the tapes would only be released after their deaths. One of those tapes featured a woman named Dolores Price, a former IRA member who admitted to driving Jean McConville to her death. She also named other senior IRA leaders as the people who gave the order, including, according to her, the future political leader Gerry Adams, who has always strongly denied any involvement in the IRA at all. When Dolores Price died, the British police began trying to subpoena those tapes from Boston College, which became an international legal battle. Some of the people Dolores Price named were arrested and questioned. The case is still officially unsolved, and 10 children grew up without their mother because someone, somewhere, decided she had to disappear. Do you think the people who ordered her killing should still face justice 50 years later? Or is the past in Northern Ireland too dangerous to dig up? Level 7. Wormwood. We've reached the deepest and darkest level of our iceberg. Wormwood is a Netflix docuseries directed by the legendary Errol Morris, and it's one of the most disturbing things ever produced, because it's not really about a TV crime. It's about a real United States government program that may have killed an American scientist on American soil. The story starts on November 28, 1953, in New York City. A man named Frank Olson, a biochemist working for the US Army, fell from the 13th floor window of the Hotel Statler. The official story was that he had committed suicide because he'd been suffering from depression. His family was given a small payment and told to move on with their lives. And for 20 years, Frank Olson's son Eric believed that story. Then, in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission released a report on the activities of the CIA. Buried in that report was a single shocking detail. Frank Olson had been part of a top-secret CIA project called MK Ultra. 9 days before his death, his colleagues had secretly slipped him LSD in a glass of Cointreau without his knowledge, as part of an experiment to test the drug as a possible truth serum and weapon. After taking the LSD, Frank Olson started having a mental breakdown and was placed under CIA supervision in a New York hotel room. That's the room he fell from. What came out of that investigation is what makes this story so haunting. Eric Olson and his family fought for the truth for over 50 years. They had Frank's body exhumed in 1994. A forensic pathologist named James Stars examined the skull and found a major head injury, that, according to him, was almost certainly caused by a blow to the head before the fall, not by hitting the ground. The conclusion of many independent investigators is that Frank Olson was not a suicide. He was murdered by people inside his own government because he was about to tell the truth about American biological and chemical weapons programs that were going on at the time. The US government has never officially admitted any of this. They paid the family a settlement and gave a polite apology for the LSD experiment, but never for the death itself. After hearing this, do you believe Frank Olson jumped from that window, or do you believe his own country pushed him? The Devil Next Door. The Netflix documentary The Devil Next Door is one of the most disturbing pieces of television ever created, because the man at the center of it lived for decades as an ordinary auto worker in Cleveland, Ohio, while being accused of being one of the most brutal Nazi war criminals in history. His name was John Demjanjuk. He came to the United States after World War II, raised a family, and worked for years at a Ford plant. He was, on the surface, a normal Ukrainian-American grandfather. Then in the 1970s, Holocaust survivors began identifying him as a man they called Ivan the Terrible, a guard at the Treblinka extermination camp who personally operated the gas chambers and tortured prisoners. In 1986, Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel for a trial that was televised and watched by millions. Survivors took the stand and pointed at him in the courtroom, saying with absolute certainty that this was the man who had beaten and killed their families in Treblinka. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. But then something disturbing happened. After the fall of the Soviet Union, new documents from the KGB archives became available. Those documents suggested that Ivan the Terrible was actually a different man entirely, named Ivan Marchenko, and that there had been a case of mistaken identity. The Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction, and John Demjanjuk was released and sent back to America. The most chilling part is what happened next. Even though he was not Ivan the Terrible, investigators continued to dig into his past. New evidence appeared showing that Demjanjuk had still been a Nazi guard, just at a different camp called Sobibor, where he was involved in the killings of around 28,000 people. He was deported again, this time to Germany, and convicted in 2011 as an accessory to murder. He died in 2012 while waiting for his appeal. After watching this case, the question becomes truly difficult. Was John Demjanjuk one of the worst monsters of the 20th century, or was he just one of the thousands of ordinary men who became part of an evil machine? Blackbird. We've now reached the very bottom of the iceberg. The Apple TV series Blackbird, starring Taron Egerton and the late Ray Liotta, is based on a true story so disturbing that the FBI itself helped create the case it's built on. The show is based on the real memoir of a man named Jimmy Keene, a former football star and drug dealer from Illinois who was facing 10 years in federal prison. The FBI made him an offer. They were investigating a man named Larry Hall, a quiet, soft-spoken cemetery worker and Civil War reenactor from Wabash, Indiana. Larry Hall had already confessed to one murder, the kidnapping and killing of a 15-year-old girl named Jessica Roach. But Hall had also confessed, then taken back his confession, to dozens of other murders of young girls across the Midwest. The FBI was convinced he was one of the most prolific serial killers they had ever seen, but they had no bodies and no proof. The deal with Jimmy Keene was simple and terrifying. He would be transferred to the prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, where Larry Hall was being held. He would befriend Hall, get him to talk about the locations of the missing girls' bodies, and bring back enough information for the FBI to confirm the killings. If he succeeded, his sentence would be wiped clean. If he failed, he would serve every year he had been given. What Jimmy Keene actually got out of Larry Hall is the part that has haunted investigators ever since. According to Keene's memoir and the show, Larry Hall began describing his darkest souvenirs, small details about specific girls who had vanished from rural towns over many years. Hall talked about the sound the dirt made when he buried them. He named places. He even drew small maps. By the end, Jimmy Keene was convinced that Larry Hall had killed close to 20 young women, possibly more, and that the FBI's worst fears were correct. But here's the part that makes Blackbird sit at the very bottom of the iceberg. Despite everything Jimmy Keene reported, Larry Hall was never charged with any of those murders. The bodies were never recovered. The families of those missing girls still don't know where their daughters are. Larry Hall is still alive in a federal prison today, and he remains officially convicted of only one killing. The question this leaves us with is the same one that haunted Jimmy Keene long after he walked out of that prison. How many girls are still buried somewhere out there, in fields and in forests, with families who have spent their entire lives waiting for an answer that never came? Looking back at these 21 stories, it's clear that sometimes the most disturbing horror is not invented by Hollywood directors. It's pulled from court documents, FBI files, and the words of victims who never got justice. From stalkers and frauds to corrupt cops and CIA experiments, to Nazi guards and missing girls, we have covered some of the darkest cases ever turned into a TV series. I'm really curious to know which of these stories is going to stay in your head tonight. Was it the cold voice of Michelle Carter telling Conrad to get back in the truck? Or was it the silence of Jean McConville's children waiting for a mother who would never come home? Sometimes I wonder if these shows make these crimes feel too clean, like they wrap the worst moments of real lives in beautiful cinematography and a good soundtrack. What do you think about that? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments because I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this deep dive and you're ready for even more mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for hanging out with me until the very end. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.